I should just say one thing, if I may, Eric. It's very important to realize that we're going to record the meeting, and it has just started. It won't be broadcast right now, but it will be broadcast later, and then you may be able to see it, I think, on YouTube and well, the London Met channel. So just to let you know, if you don't want to be filmed or recorded, you may still follow the proceedings. Just make sure you switch off your camera and your mic. That's all. And then the order of work is very simple. Eric is of course hosting the event. David will be speaking for about half an hour or so in all freedom, and then there will be questions on the part of Nick Temple. You probably can see on the screen. Christian Frost, if he wishes to contribute, and also Matthew Barac, if he wishes, and before Eric opens it to the floor. That's the pragmatics of it. I'll shut up right now. So Eric, if you wish.
Many thanks. So by way of introduction, I'm Eric Parry, and I wish and welcome you to join us today for the first of what we intend to be a series of seminars, which we will host here at our virtual studio locus. So you know, it's a huge delight tonight to welcome our speaker, very eminent architect, critic, writer, and teacher, Professor David Leatherbarrow, whose chair is at the School of Design, the University of Pennsylvania, and whose subject tonight is titled Whole Parts, Urban Architecture in and Out of Scale. I think just simply to say that we, the broader architectural community, and that's a very international one, and certainly for me personally, over 4 decades, I can say, are hugely indebted to David for sharing his wisdom for many of us, far-flung, as I've said, and therefore mainly through his writing, which has built up to be an invaluable source of deep-rooted and accessible meditations on architecture, which I frequently go back to, not least because of the extraordinary range of architectural work that he refers to with such coherence and interest, of many architects who are perhaps less part of a star firmament, but nonetheless have made really wonderful contributions. I think all that time, you know, and work has been rewarded recently by the Topaz Medallion. And I just before we start would wish to congratulate David, because it represents, you know, a lifetime of achievement with much more to come. And tonight's event, I believe, will be the beginning of new chapters. So we're hugely looking forward, David, and it's an honor to have you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Great pleasure. Let's see if we can get the PowerPoint started. José, is that visible?
Not yet.
Is it apparent now?
Yes, if we click on the image, yes, we've got it.
Everyone can see it, so I could begin?
I can see it. I'm sure everyone can.
Yes.
Again, thank you, Eric. And your intuition is correct. This is a first sketch for a project I'm about to begin, or in some ways have begun. I decided to do some work with former students, and they're contributing chapters to a book whose working title is more or less what you see on the screen. In this short talk, I'll sketch a thesis concerning works of architecture as whole parts. By that I mean projects that are internally defined, complete in themselves, approximately autonomous, but whose coherence includes a dimension of partiality with respect to wider frames of reference, a landscape of counterparts. My thesis is this: a well-designed work is a whole that is perforce partial. I'll try to show that autonomy thus qualified, maybe engaged autonomy, allows single projects to provide future designs with models for unexpected and unexpectedly relevant urban form. My arguments are prompted by doubts about today's totalizing urban systems, infrastructure, landscape urbanism, eco-determinism, and so on, as well as by market-driven architectural aesthetics. Nordicern calls for social justice allow us to continue to ignore the spatial and social fragmentation of contemporary culture and cities. In short, my aim is to restate architecture's limited responsibility, together with its corresponding need for wider awareness, not as a matter of choice, but of every project's internal definition. Despite decades of alternately progressive and reactionary claims about dramatic crises in contemporary urban culture, most cities and good urban architecture show some measure of cultural continuity, no matter whether you consider Shanghai or Stockholm or even Santiago. At least parts of the cities indicate this. Obviously, sizes have changed. Buildings are taller, infrastructure bigger, open spaces wider, and more heterogeneous, to say nothing about the ever-increasing density and expanse of urban settlements throughout the world. Yet in every city's different localities, intelligible topography is still in evidence, though clearly fragmentary, not despite radical changes, which could be overcome through repetition of pre-modern typologies, nor thanks to them in the form of what has been called big architecture, megastructures, or large-scale engineering projects. No, it's because individual works have contributed to both the transformation and continuity of our cities. It's my thesis that over time, here I'm showing Sao Paulo, the work of Paulo Mendes de Rocha. Over time, cities have the capacity to absorb interventions that initially oppose them. Scale and proportioning are at issue, but no less so disorientation and divergence, together with the productive potential of intelligent but unprecedented projects. Insofar as scale is a matter of relationships, I think the heart of the issue is difference, or the separateness that sustains mutuality. I mean when parts are seen as counterparts, not despite, but precisely because of dissimilarity. Before turning to my specific examples, I'd like to say just a little bit more about what I'm calling whole parts. As I've said, they possess internal coherence. According to the measure established by Alberti centuries ago, he argued for an internal order that would be destroyed by any addition or subtraction. Second, insofar as I have an echo now. Insofar as they are parts that point beyond themselves, a whole is always only implied. Their, I'll call it, intrinsic externality allows them to suggest, imply, or project complementary forms. I realize there's something unsettling here. A whole part's internal coherence inclines it away from pre-existing patterns and systems, diverging from configurations that had been till then familiar and well managed. Lastly, importantly for me, as years pass into decades, whole parts suggest new forms of cooperation. Every discrete design, so conceived, shows itself to be non-discrete over time. Certainly not immediately, subjected, perhaps condemned, to unfoldings its author had never foreseen. I've introduced my question as one that has intellectual and practical force today. That doesn't mean it's only a contemporary problem, for there are many precedents in 20th century architecture, some very well known. Perhaps the most famous, possibly notorious case is Corbusier. Very briefly, I'll consider three of his projects, each at a different scale, after which I'll turn to another three examples, but each of them from the city in which I live and work, Philadelphia. In a co-authored and in some ways reprehensible text called Home of Man from 1942, Corbusier published a drawing I'll call Hexagonal France. Not a topic, the entire country, one would call modest. He began his explanatory text matter-of-factly, quote, "Let us now consider the country as a whole." Much hinges on what he meant by consider. Prior to the developments the sketch proposes, France had become, he observed, quote, emptied, anemic, and contaminated. Depressed and depressing regional centers, isolated rural areas, highways, and rail lines. Were the developments he sketched to be elaborated and implemented, the country would, he said, blossom with an abundant nature to which all activities could be attuned. A corresponding benefit would be the network of communications he proposed. Despite its allegiance to things no one designed, I mean nature, his geometry is very insistent, promising much greater coherence than the France we've known. Yet the drawing, thankfully, is only a sketch, not a design, still less a plan. At the scale of the countryside, more exact rendering would not have been possible. Still, he had a strong desire to comprehend, he said, to consider a scale beyond the community and the city, a geography with greater consistency. Despite this scale, inspired by laws of solar circuit shown in the diagram at the bottom of the page. So the unity or coherence the sketch describes includes sites of agriculture, complementary rural industries, and rural centers. Linear industrial cities are there too. But while only one part of Europe, France was, in this image at least, imagined to be a whole in itself. Admittedly a very big whole, but again, partial with respect to Western Europe. A similar line of thinking can be seen at the scale of the community. The case I have in mind is Corbusier's little-studied competition entry for Îlot Insalubre, number 6 of 1936. No less whole and partial, also disruptive when existing conditions are considered. The competition's specific site in Paris's 11th arrondissement 17 areas that in 1921 had been identified as insalubrious and, quote, destined for demolition because of poor health generally, but especially the frequency of tuberculosis cases. Given all that's typically said about Corbusian urbanism, his assumed disdain for pre-existing conditions, it's important to stress, I think, that this project didn't propose demolition, but offered a creative response to the clearing the city authorities had already intended. One such site, I suppose you know, is the Centre Pompidou, the result of a similar clearing that was envisaged for this project. A familiar proposal and justification prefaced his explanation. Nature was to be brought into the town because both the house and the city are, quote, governed by the 24-hour cycle of the sun, today and tomorrow, as in the past. Large or small, foreign or familiar, projects would discover commonalities when encompassing natural conditions set the rule for their integration. Some elements in the existing city were to be preserved, however. Into the irregular configuration of pre-existing routes and public spaces that predated his project, he inserted a framework of one of streets, another of public green spaces, and a third of buildings that imposed a new scale and new orientation. As for routes, there were to be the major ones that connected this location to the rest of the city. You see at the top the Grand Traverse at the north, but to the south, the pre-existing Boulevard Diderot, and passing through the center, the ancient Rue de Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Connecting the two peripheral through streets was a very large green park with meandering paths following or emphasizing, sometimes even constructing, contours of the land, edging clusters of trees, providing links to nearby pre-existing communities, this part's counterpart. The sports fields, running tracks, tennis courts, and swimming pools were meant to be open to people who lived in the new blocks and the neighboring communities. The buildings followed an orthogonal framework of large-scale Rodan housing blocks and smaller-scale schools, all aligned with the cardinal directions. Rather like a tailor sizing a pattern to a specific person's body, the Rodan blocks were cut to fit the geometries and distances of the existing urban fabric. But I think the outcome was less a patchwork than a fabric, measured to both his idea of the modern city and equally to the existing conditions. Divergence of the new from the old was plainly evident, but eventual interdependency was also proposed, according to rules internal to the project. The last Corbusian design I want to briefly describe is the Salvation Army building, also, as you know, in Paris. Three characteristics of the location complicated the design. Its position between two non-parallel streets, the sloping ground across its long dimension, and the position of existing non-Salvation Army buildings. The key aspects of the design are these: Corbusier's recognition of the configuration of the quarter implied in the orientation he established, his invention of effectively two new ground levels that unified the parts of the project, but were both unprecedented and unseen from the outside. And thirdly, his projection of future development, you see in the lower right here, along lines of his building into the outlying areas of the quarter as a whole. I think it's significant that he tried to double the ground level of the site he was given. Both levels are idealized platforms. The raised one established a topography of orientation and entry, by mediating both lines of approach from both ends of the building. The other, the lower garden platform, established a topography of the building's inner coherence by unifying its disparate parts. On the first platform, movement always proceeds orthogonally, one direction public, the other increasingly private. On the lower level, movement circles in on itself through the lower and upper terraces, gardens, workshops, and the clinics just off to the right of this view shown on the left of my slide. These two platforms, let's say framework above and earthwork below, which are approximately urban and domestic, establish the ensemble in a vicinity that both conditioned the project and resulted from it. Thanks to the project's internal coherence, as well as its insistently unified facade, obeying, I think, similar compositional rules to his early paintings. At three scales then, geographic, urban, and architectural, a project's internal coherence initially diverged from, but in time contributed to, a restructured milieu. To elaborate this point a little bit more fully, I'll now turn to projects in a single city, Philadelphia. From the moment the Benjamin Franklin Parkway was first proposed, the nearby but huge Fairmount Park was intended to penetrate the city center more or less like a woodland archipelago, with all the characteristics of the destination, I mean the park, presented at the point of departure, which is to say a city square, despite the dislocation such abbreviation of distance required. But one can also see the parkway as an extension of the town, if you will, a projection that expressed not sylvan pleasure, but metropolitan urbanity, basically an avenue, notable still today for its monumentality. Like soldiers in formation, the parkway's buildings were to parade toward a clearing at the base of the hill on which the Art Museum currently sits. That assembly space was also to be ringed by grand cultural buildings, but neither the plaza nor the boulevard was built as intended. Instead, what I've characterized as a green wedge of a park in which a handful of institutions were more or less scattered, pavilion-like. None of this will please a mind dedicated to neat typological distinctions. While similar urban forms exist elsewhere, no precedent for this could be found in Philadelphia. No street is quite so wide or nearly so park-like, nor are Philadelphia streets typically terminated this way. Once the parkway gains speed, it comes to an abrupt halt in a traffic circle, either at the base of the Art Museum, either at the base of the Art Museum or in the long shadow of City Hall. Wider than a typical boulevard, but shorter, less like a route than a place, in service of containment as much as movement. The benefits of connecting the city to the park were not only recreational and aesthetic, but practical. For many decades, the Schuylkill River, which you see here, supplied Philadelphia residents with fresh water. Before the museum was built, pumps met the city's growing needs by feeding water up to a reservoir on top of the hill, Vermont. It was the mountain, if there is a mountain in Philadelphia, on top of the hill, from which the water was then conducted to city streets and squares by subsurface pipes. But after upstream factories polluted the river, the basins were emptied and then refilled with soil on which the museum eventually took its stand. The parkway's diagonal line follows the path of old supply pipes. From this point on the left to the end point on the right, and the fountains at so-called Logan Circle sit on top of the original distribution point. Streets as straight as this one are innumerable in Philadelphia's urban grid, but there are just a few diagonal cuts, the earliest of which trace pre-settlement Native American trails. This route, designed by Jacques Crébert, was cut through existing urban fabric, houses, factories, clinics, businesses, with considerable effort and great expense, rather like 19th century train lines in European capitals. The divergence was striking, insistently straight, but non-orthogonal. Part of the grid, but obliquely. Urban and park-like. Exceptionally wide, but largely undifferentiated. Connective, yet isolated. I want to say, concluding this, that it's a much-loved urban element, loved by citizens and impressive to visitors. But nevertheless, the parkway's sense of space was, and I believe remains, undecided. Along the parkway, the Rodan Museum, designed by Paul-Philippe Cray, displays, I think, a similarly ambiguous engagement with competing frames of reference, the park and the town, or perhaps divergent lines of descent, as if two parents had jointly contributed to its formation. Without doubt, the most visible sign of the Rodan Museum is not the body of its contents, the thinker. As a sign of the museum's inwardness, a more self-absorbed and disengaged figure can hardly be imagined. Encircled concentration is expressed through crossed limbs, lowered shoulders, and raised knees, all drawn inward magnetically, as if the world had no gravitational pull. Lost in thought, he seems completely oblivious to traffic and trees. Yet I think for all his concentricity, his position and posture play their parts in wider circumstances. Castings of Rodin's great work have positioned in one of major museums throughout the world. In Cleveland, as you see here, you can find him in Tokyo. There are in and around Paris, one at the Musée Rodin, which you see here, and the other at Meudon, Rodin's house, studio, and exhibition hall. Neither of these locations, none of them, is the spot the sculptor initially preferred. He thought the thinker should be placed at the end of Rue Soufflot, facing, as you know, Luxembourg Gardens and Palace, with its back to the Pantheon. The Meudon thinker sits on the villa's front lawn, facing the town, resting on Rodin's grave as well as that of his wife. In Philadelphia, where the grave is only a memory, nothing nearby focuses the thinker's thought. Obviously whole, pensive concentration does not prevent the trunk and limbs from being somewhat outgoing. His top half turns leftward against the upright posture proposed by the hips. The arms complicate matters, indicating even greater nonconformity. En masse, and despite the first impression of inwardness, the thinker does incline out and downward, eccentrically. Not exactly toward anyone viewing him, but I think more widely and basically toward the ground on which the viewer stands. All one can really say about his orientation is that it's outward and probably abysmal. Strikingly, the thinker has a double in the building. At the center of its facade, Paul Kray formed a loggia-like hollow to house a full-side casting of the gates of hell. The thinker, first envisaged as a portrait of Dante, then Rodin said more or less any poet, always had a central place on the gates, on the midline at the level of the lintel hood. But this one too inclines away from its assigned moorings. The inclination of the brow on the gates is beyond the tangle of condemned bodies below, toward the pool at the center of the sunken garden. I've said the boulevard bronze sits on a stage that's backed up by a freestanding wall. You see him off to the right and the wall to the left. Unexpectedly, it's one that imitates a wall Rodin himself constructed in Meudon between 1907 and 1910. That wall, in turn, was a relocated and rebuilt fragment of the Chateau d'Issy, a building largely burned in the Commune of 1871 that Rodin, 35 years later, used to house and exhibit his work. Still later, he had the ruined facade rebuilt at his villa. In Philadelphia, of course, the facade wasn't rebuilt, but reproduced. In the open expanse of the parkway, the d'Issy facade looks like a garden ruin, though it sits on a deck that suppresses the soil. The platform makes it congruent with the parkway, but the ruin itself is attached to the garden, pool, and museum beyond. All three come as something of a surprise once you pass through the gate wall, mainly because the space is sunken and remarkably quiet. So for all its concentricity, I'll call it a horizontal version of the thinker's inwardness, the garden also inclines forward toward the museum, giving the end wall topographical significance, concentrating in a single line and sectional change a cluster of transitional elements or settings. Composite in its makeup, and no less attached to the garden it terminates than the interiors it encloses, the museum's facade is both an element within the overall ensemble and a condensation of its several settings. This looking outward, perhaps their most vivid and eloquent expression. The building's internal configuration in plan and section both confirms and concludes the proleptic figures that structure and pace the approach. The parkway, thinker, the gate wall, garden, gates of hell, sculpture, and the facade. Although internal cohesion among parts gives the work great self-sameness and identity, the repetitions, displacements, and ambiguities of levels and distances are, I think, all evidences of the play between the several parts and the whole of the wider ensemble. One more whole part to discuss before I end. We're standing within it here, the Barnes Foundation, designed by Todd Williams and Billy Shen. Here you see it from the Rodan Museum. The new Barnes is one among the several institutions that stand along the parkway or within the landscape that leads to Fairmont Park. The city landscape tension we've seen in the parkway repeats itself in the building, which encloses a garden within a building that is itself enclosed by a park that is in turn surrounded by the town. In spatial terms, this means the primary settings were alternately enclosed and open, no less attached to the soil and sky than to the street. scales and sequences of civic rooms pass from landscape to garden, pool, and then more sequestered but displaced exhibition rooms, given the strict requirements that the new hang reproduce the old. Lastly, the largest civic space in the project, you see here, is sited within massive walls. A paradoxical inversion, but one I think that's suited to a time when the public domain has so largely and disappointingly atrophied. These 6 examples, I've briefly described whole parts at 3 scales. Each, I think, is coherent in itself, but not for that reason wholly detached from the city it appears to disregard. Parts have counterparts to which they contribute, initially by opposition, eventually by complementary engagements. Wholeness, the explicit or tacit premise of decades, perhaps centuries of urban thinking, should be, I'd like to argue, reconsidered as a kind of configuration that tolerates delays or postponements in its realization. It must also subject itself to a future of anonymous, but no less decisive contributions, partial, though each of them must surely be. That's it. Thank you.
David, thank you hugely for that. Let's open it now to dialogue and invite questions that maybe we can channel via our ringmaster José this evening.
Well, I think Nick Temple wanted to start. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm afraid I just did.
No, thank you very much, David. That was a really incisive, very thoughtful study and presentation, and I think it nicely puts in the context a kind of a body of work that I've read and nurtured over the years. So I just wanted to kind of reflect a little bit on the context of the material that the presentation you've given. I'm just intrigued by this idea of whole parts and this whole kind of issue of scale. And the choice of references that you've looked at here, starting with Le Corbusier's kind of imaginary plan of France, and this notion of the country both or being autonomous, but also part of a whole, the whole of Europe, projecting down to Le Corbusier's housing project, and the idea of this idea of shared space that links between the complex of buildings and, of course, the interstitial areas that lie around it. And then finally, of course, to the Salvation Army building. And in a way, I think the one thing that reminds me of your interest, of course, in this question of whole and part in the context of urban fabric is the work that you've done on the whole study of topography and architectural settings, which, of course, is the kind of underlying thread that runs throughout much of your work. And I'm reminded of the writings, of course, that you did for Topographical Stories on Common Ground, seminal texts that actually prompt a lot of thought, certainly for me as an architect and an architectural academic and teacher. But I'd like to go to this issue of you described earlier about intelligible topography. And you talk about the idea of topography, not just about terrain, but also about this idea of the inclusiveness of topography, about practical affairs and traces, something that lies really at the heart, I think, of much of the research that you've done. And one of the real problems that we have as architects is the way in which buildings are treated as kind of autonomous blocks, and the idea that it's about the spaces between buildings rather than the interactions between buildings and the large urban context. And one particular study that you did, which is also in Philadelphia, which had a very powerful influence on me, which I think relates nicely to all the details that you've done, all the sources, particularly I think the Barnes Museum, and that's the PSFS building, which you did a wonderful presentation in the article called Practically Primitive, where you argued very similar things about this issue of scale and the relationship between building and the way in which it is integrated within.
Nick seems frozen.
Yes, there seems to be a problem there. I'm very sorry about that.
The large. Can you hear me?
Now we can. We lost you for a minute, Nick.
Oh, okay. So I just, in a sense, what my particular interest in I mean, the choice of your subject areas, I think, is interesting in this presentation, because I was really taken by your exploration of Philadelphia and Fairmount Park and the relationship between the terminations of the Parkway, Logan Circle, and of course the way in which you describe in a lot of detail the Rodan sculpture, and almost the Rodan sculpture, the introspective nature of the sculpture becomes a kind of foil to the setting, in the sense he's not orientated to anything in particular, and becomes a very interesting way of thinking about the relationship between urban space and architecture, that somehow the thinker becomes a kind of expression, almost a metaphor of architectural space and ultimately of your idea of topography. So there's something interesting about this relationship that you've articulated. But I'd like to make pose a question here, and that is getting back to the crucial issue of scale, and reflecting on the fact that, you know, as you highlighted in your outline for the lecture, where we have almost two kind of positions about cities. One is that this desire to preserve the existing scale of the historic city, and at the other extreme we have those who kind of advance the idea of megastructures, mega blocks within cities that take over urban space and actually call it their own, become virtually in themselves object-like. And in a way, this idea of trying to find a terrain that brings these different conflicting positions into dialogue, which I think is beautifully expressed actually in your study of the Philadelphia, the PFS building, which is one of my favorite studies that you've written, is how we look at this in the context of, in a sense, the idea that the architecture itself becomes, you know, configuration rather than object. And where in this is there an issue that we need to look at in the contemporary city, with developers and architects collaborating, when we're looking at the idea that the dangers of whole swathes of cities being developed as virtually autonomous objects? So in a sense, where exists the notion of civic ground within the vast developments that we see happening, for example, in London? And when you articulate this idea of the interstitial space, the space that's shared between developments and new developments and surrounding spaces, the generosity that presents, how do we achieve something like that within the context of the contemporary city, when we have, of course, great swathes of privatized space, completely fenced off and isolated? Where is the common civic ground that we can share? And in a way, the presentations you've done of Philadelphia reflect on in a way a kind of a legacy, but one which is sometimes very difficult to understand, to appreciate in many contemporary developments that certainly I see in my own town and other places around the world. So that's really a question about this issue of civic ground when we're exploring the idea of scale, when scale becomes a matter of commercial profit, pure and simple. How can an architect address that on the basis of the kinds of projects that you've presented tonight?
It's a number of issues, Nick, many of which are demanding and would require some more kind of preparatory materials to address. Step number one is what I guess for present purposes I'll call adopting a middle scale, not the really great private houses of modern architecture, and not the implausible big plans of the modernist, but the institutions that are responsible for themselves, but are by definition open to whomever. That's where my work is right now, because I have a concern that is, I think, probably narrowly defined as architectural. I know there are important professions called planning and landscape urbanism, and no less important would be something like interior design and the other pictorial arts. But architecture, I think, has its own set of tasks and can contribute to what I believe you're calling civic ground. So what I hoped to sketch out today is, first of all, the ambition to make such a contribution. Secondly, give it a name, that it's a matter of relationships, which in our tradition we call either proportionality or scale. And thirdly, say that this can operate at different sizes, in different programs, and with different instruments. So how the connectivity, the relationships, the provisioning of common ground is established, that's one body of questions we can address to historical materials, we can use in criticism with respect to current work, and in design teaching, we can pose as task for students to understand and begin to explore in their own work. That's on the side of, if you will, tactics or operations of working at the middle scale. But I think, important as that is, I think it should be preceded by a recognition of a certain domain in which I believe we should work today. And I've tried to differentiate between responsibility and awareness. And the architect should have her or his sense of responsibility. This is my project. But I believe part of that project, I called it an intrinsic externality, that one's way of working is simultaneously dependent on engagements what is outside the control of the project. That's not responsibility for the city, not even for the neighborhood. It's awareness of its constraints, possibilities, qualities, etc. So if there is to be something common, I take it that architecture is aware of that potential commonality, but is not responsible for constructing it. Maybe this is a retreat on my part, but I'm a little bit cautious these days about what architecture, big architecture, megastructural architecture, and large-scale planning efforts have arrogated to the imagination of a single individual. So what the way I thought I could present this thought is to say, Corbusier, crazy as he was, ambitious as he was, left us only a sketch for this ridiculous idea of France. Nonetheless, he felt the need to think France, just as he felt the need to think of Paris, in order to be responsible for the Salvation Army building. So those kinds of thinking as dimensions of a project elaborate the opening premise of responsibility plus awareness, keeping the two distinct, and suggesting that there is room for architects to contribute to what could become, through agencies the designer can't foresee, could become something like a common civic ground. So mine is perhaps slightly less ambitious than what you've suggested about architects taking it on as their task. I believe design is a form of participation, and that participatory act is this mediation between what I earlier called responsibility and awareness. Does that help at all?
Yes,
Yeah,
thanks very much. Sorry, Eric.
No. I just saying we have a huge auditorium. You know, we have almost 100 people, but I can see there's one hand up, and and that's Christian Frost.
Yes, Christian.
So could we turn to Christian? Thank you, Nick.
Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, David. It was
wonderful to see you, Christian. All the best.
Good to see you too. Really enjoyable and the use of language, and I'm very interested in this idea of responsibility and knowledge being a cultural knowledge, which I think is really important. But I think many people in the room, I mean, maybe not me as much as perhaps other people, might be interested to understand why you didn't use the word picturesque at all. Because many of the things that you're talking about, if you talk with architects in the current genre, use that word a lot for the type of relationships that you're perhaps alluding to, albeit I think maybe the clue is in the cultural depth rather than the visual depth. But I'd be interested in your reasoning, because it's very interesting that in yours and in Nick's, the word was completely absent, and yet very recently I saw an extraordinary talk by John MacArthur in a similar platform from Australia, where everything is picturesque in a sense. So there's this very interesting absence of it. I'm interested to know what you have to say.
Yeah. Well, there's a personal and a more interesting reason. The personal reason is I have a very close friend on the faculty at Penn, John Dixon Hunt, and I just, certain words I have to give to him and not use on my own, because I have to spend all my time explaining myself which meaning of picturesque I have in mind. I want to emphasize, I want to recall in my own work, I believe it's time for us to recall the architect's responsibility to his or her project. And I pushed my point a little bit today with the term autonomy. I think projects begin and end, even though the built work exceeds what you intended. So there is, in my current thinking, autonomy of conception and engagement in realization. And the self-sameness of the project is what I'm trying to secure. Now, perhaps some picturesque landscapes have that self-sameness, but the tendency is toward an incidentalism, an occasionalism, and a kind of open-endedness, which I think is adequate to the temporal reality of urban transformation, but insufficient for the remit that is properly architectural, which I'm saying on the drawing board, in conception, runs the risk of autonomy. I believe it's a risk, but I believe it's a necessary risk. Otherwise, one is doing something other than what I understand architecture to be. So I would like to hold on to the relative autonomy of Rodin's thinker, its concentricity, its inwardness. I don't know if you've ever tried to adopt that pose, but it's really hard to use your left elbow on your, it's really hard. It's a strain, and that strain of a body that's expressive in and of itself is what I want to advance as step one, but immediately followed by a second step, which says part of that internal definition is an implied outwardness, engagement, and set of correspondences that, when disclosed through time, approximates picturesque experience in your terms. But for me, in the current debates, when there's so much talk about systems and large-scale involvements and mapping entire scenes, I want to, at a high level of abstraction, I want to secure the internal definition and cultural substance of the project. So that's why I would hesitate to describe a whole part structure as picturesque, because I want the wholeness of that part. Does that help, Christian?
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, I wouldn't have used the word either, but I was very interested because for similar, but I mean, I wouldn't have described them so poetically. But yeah. But I think it's a very interesting thing, and it perhaps relates to Nick's. For me, there's a sort of often a laziness of reference, which in particularly urban dimensions, which is often lost. And the use of the picturesque or the incidental is too easy a way to get around a much deeper cultural relevance historically that you find in the structures of cities that are often, as you say, not creating but responsive to a culture, and that the architecture works within that framework. So I was just using it. It was just very interesting for me that to get your particular reference on that answer. Thank you very much. That's really great.
And thank you.
Right. Sorry. Got more questions.
I think that Matthew Barac is poised, if I'm right. So that would be a wonderful follow, please.
I happen to be poised. Thank you, Eric, and hello, everyone. I just, in that moment when Eric said it about...
You've gone mute, Matthew.
In that moment where Eric said it about there being 100 people in the auditorium, it sort of struck me how strange this trajectory is to get to today, in a way, because of the different conversations that have got us here. There were a couple of phrases in David's response a moment ago about things like the current debate, what Eric said, 100 people in the room, this tension between responsibility and awareness, and this phrase cultural substance. And I just wanted to reflect for a second on the some of the conversations between us and José and Eric that got us here to this event this evening. They hark back, I guess, to a seminar which goes back in a sense to Essex in some ways. And I was at an event the other day virtually called The Practice of Research, where Helen Thomas was showing photographs from those days, and then from the way some of those conversations continued at other kitchen tables. For me, it's about 33 years since I first attended what in those days we just called the seminar in the library at Scroop Terrace in Cambridge. And we, at that time, as third years, used to scuttle in behind the diploma and MPhil students, some of us with permission from Dalibor or Peter to be there and some not. And at that time, Eric was teaching us with David Bass and Peter Carl and Carolyn Steele. But there was very much a humanity and an intimacy to those kinds of conversations, the creak of the table. There was a directness about being there. And that seems to be almost a sort of a duty for a number of us, certainly, in trying to pull this conversation together. But it's a conversation that's difficult to sustain in this virtual environment, and in this world where it's increasingly hard to be, number one, sensitive as an architect, and number two, civic, as Nick was saying earlier. So partly just to plug this series as it goes forwards, because we're very excited to be having this dialogue with Eric Parry Architects through José mostly at the moment. But this aspiration in this new environment to start to form something like a collegium in which we can have conversations at this interface between practice, between doing architecture and thinking and talking architecture at the same time, is a real aspiration for us. And so, yeah, please all do follow the Centre for Built Ecologies on Eventbrite to be told what's coming next, and we're hoping to do something once a month. But just on this note, I wondered, David, what you feel about the possibility of these architectures of sensitivity and awareness, or having conversations which can contribute meaningfully to that kind of generosity that Nick is envisaging, in the context of these challenges of virtuality and of the distance that comes between us.
It's a challenge. I must say that situations like this one, that are well prepared, clearly conceived, and thus far focused on a few, not many issues, hold great promise. In my teaching, I have to admit, I'm less optimistic. I lectured yesterday, and I'm sure it was okay, not great, not terrible. But to get the students to, first of all, put their videos on, secondly, expose their uncertainties with questions that indicate partial understanding, it's very, very hard to build anything like a discussion. People can listen, can take notes, and perhaps even learn from presentations. But it's a commonplace of most studies of language that the words are, 40, 50% of the content. 40% of it is the way they're said. And probably 20% of the way it's said is the way the body leans forward or back, sideways or straight up. So the corporeality of the communication doesn't survive the digital transmission, at least in any palpable way. And I find it hard to sense what is implied in what has been said online. I certainly can understand the words, but as I've said, I believe that's half the story at most. So how to approximate the fullness of understanding, God knows. But one tries, and maybe we'll get better at it. But right now, I don't really enjoy it the way I've enjoyed teaching for 4 decades. This, however, where I guess I don't mind risking things that I half understand, because I have a hunch people will contribute to a better understanding. Somehow it may be possible among certain groups or with certain kinds of preparation or certain focus on particular, not any themes. Maybe there are some things we can do in the orchestration that will make them more productive. But I too have those recollections. We weren't in Scroope Terrace. We were in the basement of the Royal Academy. And it was a photo lab, and we smelled the chemicals. But Joseph also brought books from upstairs in the library. So it was a very improbable, almost Dada situation, but nonetheless had a kind of concreteness and memorable character to it that I suppose each of us who is trying to teach has as a recollection, and finds ways of transforming, interpreting, and reenacting some of those expectations for the kind of communication one calls teaching and learning. I think it can be done, Matthew, and I think it's great you guys are attempting it. And thus far, it's a very pleasurable session and accomplishment, and superior to what I've been able to do in my own teaching, which is all online right now, all of it. Even my PhD supervisions are online.
Can we just pause on that point, because I think it's a hugely, there's a massive cautionary tale about the corporeal and the middle scale, as you call it, David. And the moment our flights of fancy in terms of the scale takes us beyond the physical to the world of planning, you know. And I would just say that I think this, you know, moving the other direction, having listened with huge pleasure today, realized that I'm in a very privileged position, because about 6 years ago, you gave me a half a day at least of a walking, you know, tour of much that you described and much else besides. But you know, I'm filled with the memory of a full-scale drawing of crets, of a metalwork detail, and so a balustrade, I believe, and some steps. So you know, just the palpable struggle that, you know, Rodan would have had within his world, Cret in his, and of course Todd and Billy at the brilliant building that you showed, just the size of those joints, the questions that you can begin to engage with at the haptic level of material and, you know, the way it comes together is something that you opened up that you know, I shed a tear, because this the virtual presentation, or the presentation, you know, through photography does not do enough for us as designers in terms of answering the questions, that the struggles of the everyday in terms of the way that materials come together, you know, are part of studio life, as it were. So, you know, I would just say thank you hugely for introducing it with those two worlds, the French and the American. You know, something of the joys of that precision, ultimately of the way space and material comes together in the middle scale. I think that's wonderful. I'm sure there are other questions. Maurice Mitchell's hand is up. I have to scroll through so many to get there. So, but could I turn to Maurice?
Maurice. Yes. I would also. Can you hear me? By the way, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes. I would also like to thank you for your presentation. It was really, really helpful to introduce this notion of responsibility rather than awareness. I've always been teaching in my teaching the idea of fluency of scale, because increasingly needing to demonstrate to the students the effect that different scales has on what they're doing, and the difficulty of drawing boundaries. I'm wondering if this concept can't be applied, and we could move the middle scale perhaps down to a slightly smaller scale. And many of our students show interest in craft as much as what we would probably imagine as the middle scale, and also I imagine that urban designers might also perhaps want to have a craft approach, and I wonder if this idea of responsibility and awareness could be bounded at different scales as well, not just in what we see as the typical architectural middle scale that we all want to protect because that's how we've experienced our careers. Because I do want to give the confidence and the awareness and the depth of awareness to people who don't necessarily want to build middle range buildings. They maybe want to do extensions because that's what the market offers, but they want to do it with a civic purpose, and they feel sometimes the architecture that's taught to them at school is meaningless compared to some of the problems that the world has and that architecture might contribute to. So whilst I really enjoy that idea of the area that you're responsible for and the area that you're aware of, I just think that should be a movable feast as well. I wondered what your reaction would be to that.
Thank you. And I agree entirely. For me, it's a kind of tacit or unspoken response to my own life, I guess, in America, where we've been told and people celebrate this sense that individuals, regardless of the wealth and status of their parents, can make a life for themselves. Individuality has become individualism, and like Nick, I have a concern for engagement, involvement, a sense of mutuality. But I guess all I'm trying to say at bottom is that mutuality presupposes a sense that you can contribute what you alone are able to contribute. Hannah Arendt once said very beautifully, in the end, one only thinks for oneself, despite the fact that it intends another. So this intending another from one's own point of view is all I really mean by part counterpart. And it's in my life in the United States, given the government we've just put behind us, a sense of one's responsibility to participate in something beyond oneself is a model for architectural thinking. Or in reverse, what I have begun to understand about effective urban architecture clarifies what I think is the task of one's cultural and social engagements. And I think that overreacting to individualism and object-oriented architecture with a broad ethical mandate for, let's say, ecological justice, that the whole subordinates the parts. This, I think, whether it's in the matter of infrastructure planning or eco-determinism, I think the big systems to which we're treated with great regularity today cancel, at least eclipse, what I believe is each person or each architect's responsibility for her or for his project. So I think that I've now made it very broad, too broad, but that ethical stance is at play no matter the size of the project, a room, a building, an ensemble of buildings. And after a certain point, you're no longer, I think, capable. One shouldn't imagine structuring more as a domain of one's own responsibility. So it's that set of issues, if you will, across disciplines, but including architecture, that has prompted my concern for this middling, this via media. It's not a dimensional issue for me. It's rather an ethics or politics of productive engagement, an intellectual and professional responsibility. Nothing is less interesting than when a friend tells you what she thinks you want to hear. So this conflictual origin of common sense is what I'm trying to re-articulate in architectural terms, that discordance and divergence and difference strengthen the observation and insight. Maybe the definition then of a neighborhood is integrated difference. So the first move is one of something improbable, but that's only the first.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by responsibility, autonomy, all of these words about the internal coherence of a project. Does that help at all, Maurice?
It does indeed. It's very helpful, and I tend to agree with you. I call it the issue of the blind man and his stick. You know, is the stick part of the blind man, or is it part of the environment? And I think there is still a penumbra, a sort of threshold between what you say you're responsible for and what risks you take in the bit you can't really take responsibility for, which is called engagement with the surroundings, which is always a bit negotiable and always a bit risky, but it's the duty of a citizen to go out there a bit and not retreat always. You know, obviously one has to be sensible and professional, but I think there is an element of risk which is necessary.
I've just finished a book called Building Time, And the last chapter of the book is called The Time of the Project. And I think it's a clue about the provisional character of projective thinking, that you have to stand on the ground you occupy, and yet you look beyond it. So that sense of the project condemned or benefiting from its temporal unfolding is, I think, a helpful key here, and clarifying the actuality of the project, what antedates the design in terms of materials or labor practices or cultural patterns of an institution, what unfolds through the design, and then the construction, then the inhabitation, and the transformation through subsequent inhabitations, additions and alterations, and finally ruination, and then after that still memory. That time of the project requires of its several participants their unique contributions. We won't have projects without the uniqueness of a contribution, but surely that isn't all there is to the project, as it absorbs and suffers antecedents and consequences.
Thank you very much. That's very, very helpful.
I think that we have Claudia Lynch there with, and that would be wonderful to hear from her.
Hi, it's actually Paddy who wants to ask the question.
That's because
Okay.
that's because Nick Temple invoked the title of his book. That's why he wants to speak.
That's not quite what I wanted to talk about, but thank you.
Wonderful to see you too. Hello.
Hi, David. Thank you, mate. That was wonderful. I know what you mean about the digital, but it is nonetheless quite wonderful to be able to engage in this way, even if the sound of the table and the possibility of a pint afterwards isn't quite there. A term that keeps coming up in our conferences I've been participating in and student reviews, it seems to be back in vogue, is the fragment. And in the kind of spirit of there being a kind of antecedent to a lot of our shared intellectual curiosity, my response at the moment to people is that they should read Dalibor Besley's essay, The Ambiguity of the Fragment, because the tendency to take a picturesque or a reified view of buildings as objects and as purely visual effects is countered, I think, by Dalibor's ethical notion that when you think about a project, you're thinking of it as a potentially profound fragment of culture, which has a temporal dimension of history, i.e., the things that were there before you, and the things that will replenish the life of the project, daily, annually. And I think that's kind of there in Corbusier's diagrams, isn't it? That he's aware that that he's disrupting things, but he's also aware that he's creating space for life to complete the project. But you didn't use the phrase fragment. You were using the phrase part or part of a whole. But I wonder whether fragment allows us to orient ourselves and to situate ourselves temporally and spatially, in the sense that when one abnegates responsibility for the whole, when one only thinks of one's project as oriented inwardly, we get object buildings and within road engineering. I think there's a slight shift in your thinking. That your recent work, you were talking about the project being oriented ecstatically, which I love, and architecture oriented otherwise. But I wonder whether there's something about the I don't think it's necessarily introversion per se of the thinker. It's more that it's kind of tacit and silent. There's enough space created between the institutional order of the museum and the rhythm of the city that maybe it's a certain anonymity that's required to allow buildings to be part of the whole.
Your comments and implicit question are very acute, Patrick. Thank you. And perhaps, as you've guessed, I was very deliberate because having debated the issue with our former colleague on a number of occasions, still find myself oscillating between the concept of an element, which is Alberti's understanding of the part, and the concept of a fragment, which for argument's sake we can associate with someone, let's say like Piranesi. I decided to invoke a middle term, part. In my thinking, it's largely to do with the theatrical analogy, playing one's part in a drama, and suggests that it avoids the choice between a system and a lack of finality. And right now, I'm trying to take a step perhaps beyond, as you've said, architecture oriented otherwise, and give some sharper definition, not so much to the orientation toward the other, but the conditions under which that orientation is possible. And that's what I mean by the wholeness of the part. But trying to find, not at the level of theory, but at in projects, moments where something internal to the design depends upon conditions outside the build work. And this intrinsic externality is the condition. Those are actually the details I'm looking for in my study. Those details that catch this double obligation of projects. Fragments, if well interpreted, accomplish this end, but there are fragments and then there are fragments, and Dalibor explained fairly beautifully. I'm trying to perhaps argue a comparable case, but without putting at risk what I see to be what I've earlier called an individual's responsibility, standing on one's own ground, which I think is the basis for agreement, where you contribute something that someone else hasn't. And this sense of the individuality of the contribution is what I'm saying is the potential of a concentric stance, such that the Rodan thinker takes. But I believe the same is the pool in the building that Jacques Grébert designed, and I believe it's also apparent in that hollow in the facade that Paul-Philippe Cray designed. So in my work and in my thinking, I'm trying to find those places that are inwardly outgoing, details of construction and of articulation and of plans that accomplish this. And I call that public architecture, urban architecture. It's not the building, and it's not the city. It's that conjunction between the two that I think many of us are looking for, and I'm trying to give some names to, and perhaps concepts for, but most importantly, examples of. So if you can hold on to the thinker, the pool, and the hollow facade as three scales of inward eccentricity, and likewise in the barns, and now we can go to other projects. The Paulo Mendes de Rocha Sculpture Museum I started with, the Sverfen edition in the Architecture Museum in Oslo. These are some of my case studies for contemporary and late 20th century urban architecture, because I think we need to build up images and examples of this style of thought. That's what I'm working on now.
Sounds great. Can't wait to read. Thank you very much.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Team Lynch. I beg your pardon for making that inappropriate intro. Yeah, but David, I think we're almost at an hour and a half. I think, I think given the virtual nature of things and not seeing more hand flag, I think we should sort of pause to end this session and hope that we can get you to come to some of the future ones. And I think that idea of accommodation, whether it be, the artist in architecture, that particularly your Philadelphia examples, exemplify, that idea of accommodation of buildings at a middle scale that come together to create an urban dialogue too, is, I hope, something we can discuss further and in more detail. But I'd just like to say on everyone's behalf, absolutely fantastic in this somewhat, dislocated world we are experiencing at the moment, to come together with such intensity and purpose and clarity. We're all hugely indebted. So many thanks, and to our colleagues at London Met and from many, many parts. So I think as we do, raise a hand and say farewell for now, and we'll be in touch.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Well, stay safe.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eric.
And all the best for the seminar, which is truly wonderful.
Brilliant.
See you
Thank
soon,
you
I hope.
So much. Thanks so much. Thank you, Eric. Thanks.
Bye, all.
José. Thank